Good morning. Thanks for coming. A little bit about, I guess we could do a little bit of background of what I do at the company, what I do at Microsoft. So I focus on the internal security, so enterprise security at the company. And so we've got a number of teams that look at like standards, requirements, application and infrastructure security. But this session really will focus on like how we engage with our product group counterparts that are developing like interesting technology like AI, and our process for getting engaged there, and how we think about assessing what this new technology is and how we're going to use it in our environment. So we really look at like scenarios and use cases and threat modeling and all that sort of stuff. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But I also want to introduce an individual on our team that's going to help me answer questions, and so that's Vivek Sharma. He's sitting down here at the bottom right. And so my thought is on this session is, it's not super technical, and I know we're at RSA, and some of you really want to go into real like gory technical details, and so we'll try to save time for questions at the end to do that. But really, this session is more of a summary of our program, our approach, like how we think about internal adoption of the AI tools and capabilities at the company. All right, so just, I guess we got the RSA disclaimer that everybody can read about this not being representative of RSA opinions or material. They don't approve any of this. But onto the agenda here. So my thought is we'll start with just kind of Gen AI risks and kind of how we think about it. And a little bit of this is like how we evolved over time when we were looking at Gen AI. Then we get into like how do we, but then based on that, based on what we thought of in terms of risks and adoption needs, like how did we approach it? Like, what's the programs we put in place to help define the standards and requirements, and how do we get that embedded into some of our existing processes? Then we'll go through just some common lifecycle approaches that we use for development and also deployment, and then some recommendations for all of you if you're in the same boat and thinking about adoption, like some of the lessons we learned along the way, and hopefully that's useful for you. All right, so let's get into some of the details here. All right, so when we first started looking at Gen AI, this was before the Copilots was really branded and it just started coming into being. That was definitely very interesting for us. Actually, part of my team got involved 3 years ago with securing a small company, like in their technology for Microsoft. And it was a company called OpenAI, and at the time, like we didn't know what it was or what it was doing, but I had the architecture team that works for me to get engaged with them, and we looked at their environment and their models, and they were doing some interesting work, and we spent a lot of quality time to secure their environment with them, which included not only development standards and helping them with SDL, but also looking at how they secure their environment and their Azure infrastructure. All right, and then they released ChatGPT, and the whole world just kind of went on fire, and we realized that, this is going to be a big deal. So based on that, then Microsoft product teams looked at how we're going to integrate and evolve the products. Like how do we make that adoption of AI embedded into the products? And so when we started seeing that integration occur, our teams like Vivek and others that work on our enterprise security team, we get engaged and we look at, okay, well, what's the scenarios and those use cases? How do we think the user is going to be interacting with this technology? What's the most likely scenarios that they're going to be using this? What does that user experience look like in addition to the threat models that we think about, right? And a lot of this results in, for us, early on was, well, this is a lot about data protection and data disclosure, and really how do we educate the employees to think about this in the right way, and then based on the level of requirements that the technology either meets or doesn't meet, we kind of constrain the adoption at the company. So like the kind of the initial phase was just like, let's assess this just like any other security technology. We would look at it, determine like, does it meet our enterprise requirements? And this is everything from like encryption down to logging, monitoring, right? Does it respect all those requirements? And we benchmark the technology against those, and then we determine, okay, based on where the technology is in that adoption curve, then we can determine like scope and deployment of the company. so again, initially it's like get our heads wrapped around it, what's the use cases and how to threat model this. But really then, as we evolved, we recognized that this was very much around, again, mentioned the like data and privacy. And I think like if you look at like OWASP top 10 for AI, and you also, like I'm sure you've walked the vendor floor and you've sat in other sessions, like the data protection, the data classification, the privacy aspects just continue to be like kind of the mainstay of how security professionals are thinking about the challenges with AI, right? How do you make sure that the AI is acting, when it's acting on behalf of the user, it's respecting user rights, when it's consuming the data, that it's inheriting the classification labels, right? So this really the foundational piece for us that we realized when we got to this data privacy area is like, wow, we really need to make sure that that we advocate for the AI models to respect the data classification and labeling. But in order for them to do that, like we actually have to have data classification and labeling widely deployed and widely adopted in the company. So we've, in the last couple of years, we really doubled down our efforts on that. And I think we're at close to 95% coverage on all of our SharePoint sites with classification and labeling, which is a big change from, I guess if I go back like 3 or 4 years, we were more at the 20-ish percentage range. Like we've got a lot of legacy stuff out there that has to get cleaned up. So we really put a lot of effort into the classification, labeling, and protection so that when we have employees that can use the AI stuff, they can inherit those labels. And we're also pushing for security controls to be based off of that labeling, right? We want security controls to be smart so that if they see a label that says, oh, this is highly classified data, we want more stringent security requirements and security controls, implemented at the time the user brings up that information. Like that's kind of our vision is let's be more dynamic in how we protect data going forward. We're not quite there yet, but that's the approach we're taking. The other aspect you have to get past the data here is when we think about the supply chain aspects, like all those pieces that come together for that AI capability. Like how does those systems interact, and are all those systems or those components of AI, are they trusted, are they protected? So, if your AI is relying on other data sources, or is your model coming from a trusted location or a trusted source? Like, how do you verify that? And so we really thought through that aspect as well, and we have that as a requirement. Let's make sure that environment is very well protected, and also that we check and verify the models are ones that we feel good about and comfortable with. Then I guess the last two things here on just trusted usage of AI, and this goes back to kind of what I was mentioning earlier, like how do we think users are going to interact with AI, and how are they going to how do we think about them using intellectual property at the company and submitting that information to AI models for summarization or insight? Yes, we want them to be able to do that. We want them to be able to get those insights to make them more effective and efficient in what they do. But we also want to make sure that we guide them to the AI services that we want them to use and that we, again, feel good about, versus like there's so many LLMs out there on the internet that all employees can access and use. So our intent here is early on, we try to direct the users to, like you call it, the paved path or the pit of success. We try to funnel them to the direction where we want them to use. But they have the ability, if they want to override that, we give them the ability to do that. They can say, no, this is personal. I want to use an LLM on the internet instead of the one that I default to at Microsoft. So we do try to balance that kind of governance and being very restrictive with giving the employees the flexibility so that they can go out there and use other LLMs if they want to, and again, hopefully for personal reasons, and get insights. Like we're not trying to constrict their environment and keep it very, very restrictive. And then, of course, there's always unknowns, and as we go through the rest of the content, we'll find we've got a couple examples of some unknowns that, kind of lessons learned that we run into as we went and deployed this. So the initial things, after we look at the risks and the things that we need to do, what are our initial approaches? Well, initially, we thought, okay, this is kind of new technology, but we're not going to treat it as something that's so revolutionary that we need to throw out everything that we've done before. We want to make sure that we leverage the existing processes and procedures we have in place today. So we have a bunch of standards and procedures that we have secure development lifecycle, we have a bunch of tooling that we run, continuous assurance tooling that we run every day to check our code, static code analysis, dynamic code analysis type of tools. Some of this is custom to us and is built at Microsoft. But so instead of creating something completely new, we were like, okay, let's augment that existing standards and procedure requirements. Let's augment that, make sure we get the requirements from AI embedded in there, and then let's leverage those existing tooling. So we use our static code analysis to hunt for LLMs and other models that we think are concerning, and so that's how we kind of scan that environment. We also have an approach where we inventory the environment and we have attribution, and I would say that's one of the most critical things that we continue to learn over and over, is that unless you have a good inventory of your technology, you're not going to be able to secure it. So one of the first things we did was figure out, okay, let's use our SDL processes and toolings, and let's crawl our development environments and inventory where AI is being used. And then we also do that for our Azure footprint as well, and all the Azure subscriptions that we run for the company. Let's look across those environments. And we have a kind of a tool that we built to go read our Azure subscriptions at scale, and we've got about 80,000 of these Azure subscriptions out there for line of business and internal usage. And so we crawl those subscriptions every day looking for where is AI services being used, and do we have good inventory and attribution so that we know the owners of those. And if there's an issue, like if there's an incident response concern, or we think they're not following the right security standards and procedures, we can follow up with those teams, right? So again, super critical on the inventory attribution part. And then the rest of this, like training awareness, kind of mentioned this earlier. We'll continue to educate users about what we expect in terms of proper usage of data, especially when it's intellectual property from the company. We do foster a lot of collaboration in the company as well. We have hackathons, and in those hackathons there's best practice sharing, and we continue to focus on that. But we also built some, and I'll get into this in the next couple slides, but we also created a new organization just for AI and thinking about our future use of AI and AR standards. Again, classification was a real big kind of realization for us that we need to ground our usage on good data classification and good labeling. So that's a mainstay of our strategy, and also one of the initial actions we took, as I mentioned. And then logging and monitoring. We continue to see the need for logging and monitoring, not only in terms of are the developers doing the right things, or is whoever's accessing the repo, or is that expected, or we see attackers getting access to the repo. So we want to have good insight on logging monitoring. Not only that, but we're also thinking and applying logging monitoring for user usage, so that when users interact with LLMs, can we trace back the activity so that we can understand what actions the user is asking the LLM to take on behalf of them, right? And so we want to have that insight and the rich data there so that we can track and identify that. So I mentioned that we built a new organization just for AI, and that's a responsible AI organization at Microsoft. And basically that organization looks at the AI strategy and AI usage in the company. They determine the standards and requirements that all AI usage and development in the company must meet. In addition to creating that organization, we also created a bunch of steering committees and groups where we get approval. We could do reviews and approval of AI development, AI deployment, and again also another avenue for reviewing strategy that's being taken and executed at the company. So this ensures that we have good coordination across the teams, there's good awareness of approach on AI, and we're, again, back to the sharing best practices and sharing approach. We want to make sure there's a lot of transparency into what teams are doing at the company so we can all leverage each other and we can all stay in sync. Like, it's a very fast-moving environment, and we're better off keeping each other informed and making sure we're all kind of rowing in the same direction, if you will, right? So we have, again, the steering committee has representation from legal, from our product leaders, from our executives at the company. We also have champs, like security champs in each of the organizations, in each of the business groups at Microsoft. And we also have AI champs in each of those groups as well. They all come together and they look at these, kind of what the future intent is of where we're going to use AI, both internally and also in our products. I think they discuss and review that, make sure we're aligned, and before we go in to do any sort of deployment at the company, there's a responsible AI deployment kind of checklist, and there's a deployment safety board, and both, whether we're doing internal deployments for enterprise usage at the company, or we're doing a deployment for customers to use, like in both those situations, right, that before we go live, the deployment safety board has to review and approve that. So some of this is kind of process heavy, sorry, but I would say the process part is very important as well, because you can have the smartest people in the world, and if we're not communicating with each other and we're not coordinated, it doesn't really matter at scale, right? And so we're really thinking, how do we make sure the company executes at scale on our AI initiatives? So then, for, again, a little bit more detail about our team and where we get engaged, we're very much focused on the enterprise usage at Microsoft, right? We are asked by product teams to provide input to their strategy and, hey, what do we think about customer usage? Because effectively, we're basically, if you're a customer of Microsoft, we're basically very much like all of you that are customers. We think about adoption of Microsoft technology, and again, we benchmark the Microsoft products when they release a new capability or new feature. We benchmark that to our enterprise standards and requirements, and then we get into some very interesting discussions if the product teams don't meet our standard requirements, and then we talk about okay, well, what's the plan to meet? Let's just say it's logging and monitoring. Or signaling to users, if they're not meeting it today, when do they think they're going to get to it? If it's 6 months from now, okay, then how do we want to work together to ensure that we have the right adoption plan, and that we're not exposing the company to excessive risk if those capabilities aren't there, right? And so that's kind of every day we're having those discussions with our product teams to ensure that we're aligned, and also we have a good plan going forward, both on products delivering the capability, but also how we're thinking of adopting the usage of that product at Microsoft without that capability, right? And then some of the other things that we've done at the company, again, that I mentioned, is in the environments that the AI lives in, we'll ensure those environments are protected. And so this is if we're running in our Azure subscriptions, we have a set of baseline controls that must be met. We have some tooling that we've built and required. We basically do continuous assurance, not only in our code areas and our repos, but also in our infrastructure side as well. So we're checking our network environments and network configurations, as well as our infrastructure configurations. Every day, our tools wake up, run the scans, check the environment, come back with reports, and if engineers are out of compliance, they get issued fixed tickets in some of our, we've got internal tools and systems that give engineers tasks to go fix issues with SLAs, right? Probably similar to how you guys run in your environment. Next couple slides are a little bit more about a little peer into SDL, just a little bit. And so this is, I mentioned that responsible AI organization and how they've developed the requirements and standards for responsible AI. Well, we take those standards, and they cover really, they've added 4 principles in addition to the existing ones that we had around privacy and security. And they have these principles around like accountability, fairness, transparency, and that sort of stuff. Those result in really 14 main goals that the Responsible AI organization has. I didn't list those 14 goals here, but if there's interest, let me know. We can follow up on it. But those 14 goals really are really focus on three main areas, and that's data protection, inheriting data, sensitivity labels, and transparency, right? And so you can see these reflected in our SDL requirements. The first one, obviously up here, and this is not an exhaustive list. I just checked the key requirements in SDL, but the first one here is hey, you have to meet the Responsible AI requirements. And then the others are sensitivity labels must be inherited. You have to respect the data sensitivity that you're consuming, right? So meaning that if the output of the LLM has to be the most stringent and the highest level security labeling of all the data that it's consumed. We want to make sure that we respect user access rights and permissions, that the LLM doesn't act on a greater data set than what the user has access to. And so we were very thoughtful and check and validate that the LLM can't have broader access than what that user has access to. And then, of course, there's the transparency part, and I think you see this if you're interacting with Bing Chat or Copilot. You see that after you get the result, there's a bunch of footnotes that tells you, how the LLM came up with those results, right? And that's because one of the core tenets that we have for Responsible AI is that, hey, the user has to be able to figure out and understand, how the LLM came up with that result. So it needs to understand where the data was sourced and how it's, aggregating that information to have that conclusion that it has, right? And then, of course, we have other things around here that's a little harder to measure, like be fair and unbiased. And some of that is done by spot checking and synthetic testing and synthetic algorithms. So if we do find issues with the development, we have built an AI bug bar, and our AI bug bar, even though it's not a one-to-one mapping with the OWASP top 10, you can definitely see a lot of coverage. It's pretty much, the OWASP top 10 is pretty much covered in our AI bug bar, right? So this is about having good inputs and making sure that you do input validation, because our concern here is obviously if an attacker can modify the inputs or you're not doing the input checking, then you can disclose additional data, or the results you'll get from the LLM isn't going to be as expected. So they can inject some malicious, not only malicious code to disclose data, but they can also change the behavior of the model. This gets into the other aspects about the model manipulation here and the training data, right? This is about more environment protection. Are we ensuring that where the model resides and where the model came from, are we ensuring those, the model is trusted and the environment is protected so that attackers can't get to it, right? And same thing with the training data, because obviously if the training data can be poisoned, then the model can be tampered with as well. And similar with the model weights and disclosure of the model. If you're processing very sensitive data, you want to make sure that the data is also not going to be disclosed, and that the results from that the model produces, you probably don't want the training data if you're using sensitive data. You want that training data or the data that it's using being disclosed. And then there's a lot of discussion on AI security around prompt injection, right? Can you, by being crafty with your prompts and what you're doing in terms of interacting with the LLM, can you get it to disclose information that it's not supposed to, right? And some of this is can you embed commands in, if you asked it to summarize an email, can you trick the LLM to execute a command that's embedded in the email? You see that example come up quite a bit, right? So just some examples of our bug bar there. So all this comes together in how we develop, this is our typical process of how we develop at Microsoft is, we have a centralized intake process those teams that are working on a feature or new capability, they run that through at the organization level, get approval from their executives. But in addition, if they're using AI technology, they run through that steering committee, right, that we talked about, that centralized team. And we disclose whether it's going to be used internal, external, and make sure that we have the right engagement there. And then what's different in terms of AI is we have this rational AI assessment that shows up here on the kind of the top bullet in the assessment area. And then the other one that is different is the AI red team. We have a specific red team that's involved in AI. They get involved to look at and assess and pen test the AI application that's being developed when it's ready. So in addition to the normal security assessments that we do on app and infra and SDL, right, does it meet SDL requirements? We have those other two aspects on, are you meeting the AI requirements, and are you, and is that AI red team, they're going to pay you a visit and go and do that work. And then before we go into production again, a review happens with all those assessments. We determine whether it's a go, no go, and again, that safety review board looks at it and approves it. The other thing to note here is that we do think that because this is a fast-moving area, that technology will change, or the attackers will come up with new innovative areas, and we're still learning here. So we want to make sure there's an ability to reassess and trigger a reassessment. And so these are things like major changes to the environment, threat model has changed, or perhaps some major piece of the code that's being used has changed. Something like authentication libraries, maybe they've changed, or we want to update that, and that would cause a reassessment here. And then similar for internal use of how we deploy Gen AI at the company. We very similar approach to what I just mentioned, but this is like internal deployment. We have a centralized intake process. We look at that. We determine where that capability is going to be used and how it's going to be used. Like we think about threat modeling that, as we mentioned earlier. We have representatives from our internal deployment teams along with our security teams. Myself, Vivek, and others in our team get involved and engaged. We also do assessments and think about deployment, like where is it going to be deployed? How are those users going to interact with it? We benchmark it to our enterprise requirements, determine if there are gaps, like what's the compensating controls that are available, and then how do we want to think about deployment in these areas? So that gets us to this additional kind of view on just how we meet our requirements at the company. When we think about those gaps and those capabilities that we need, again, we enumerate those as part of that responsible AI standard and in SDL, and we measure ourselves to that. But because we're Microsoft, a large part of those compensating controls that we use, or other controls that we use when we do these deployments, is Microsoft based, like surprise. So this is like, for us, classification, protection, and labeling is Microsoft Information Protection and Purview. We also use Defender for Cloud Apps to look at, not only help with the classification, but also activity, like who's accessing what, especially in the cases of like an incident, if we have to do retroactive reviews of access. And we also use Defender for Cloud Apps for implementing more restrictive access to restrict users from, say, if there's a specific LLM out there on the internet that we don't want them to use, we can use that to control access there as well, right? And all this results in, okay, for our internal deployments, when we go and deploy it, we deploy Copilot or in-house developed applications and tools to get this done at the company. So just a couple examples here of how we've done this. One of them is, both I think are fairly public that I'll mention here. So we had one challenge. We had, maybe it was like 6 months ago, we were thinking about this scenario of employee usage and employee interaction with LLMs on the internet. And we had the discussion with our executives about, hey, this is a concern, and what do we want to do? Because we actually, with that logging and monitoring that I mentioned, we were seeing a lot of traffic go out to third party, what we call third party or internet available LLMs. So we raised that up through our executives and that steering committee, and had the discussion with them, and there was agreement, well, we should restrict user access to the ones that we're really uncertain about and concerned about. So that happened on like a Thursday, that decision. So on Friday, Vivek, myself, and a couple others from our implementation team and security team get together and like, okay, like let's review the security controls that we can apply. We're in this chat with our CISO and meetings with our CISO all day. And we review our options. Like we've already been directed that we need to go and restrict this access. So, how restrictive do we want to be, and what's the, how we're going to approach this? And depending on the approach we took, like the kind of situation we wound up with was, regardless of what we implemented, the user experience wasn't going to be great. So we knew we were going to get a bunch of feedback from users, because when we implemented the restrictive control, what they would just see is like, hey, this site is not available anymore, without a whole lot of detail. And so, we had to stand up a bunch of internal sites to explain what was going on to the users, and have to prepare the help desk for that response. But we wind up really using a combination of Defender for Cloud Apps and Defender for Endpoint to implement those restrictions and to prevent users from going to what we thought were risky LLM sites out on the internet. Would just say we implemented that control at like 12 noon on that day, and almost, I would say it was less than 15 minutes, we started getting calls from the help desk, and we started seeing the data volumes of help desk calls rise. Like we had a direct feed from the help desk people, and they were telling us like employees are seeing these sites blocked, they're asking a lot of questions. And then the one that really kind of we should have thought about, and this was like goes into the lesson learned category, is that we were blocking OpenAI, right? So that quickly, like, not only was it not good for us internally to do that, just because we had a lot of employees that were doing testing and validation with OpenAI, and ChatGPT was all the rage at the time, but also in the press, like press picked it up right away. Like I would say within 20 minutes, the press, it was on industry news sites and things, and within, so again, like within the hour, it was like all over the news, and we were getting calls from our executives of, what are you guys doing? So we turned that off within 2 hours. So by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we had that specifically for OpenAI, we had that block removed. But yet, I think we still had calls going on and complaints internally for the next like week or so, and then eventually died down, right? So just tell the tale. So as a little bit of a cautionary tale is like, just be ready for, like, even though you're got approval and you're executing in the best intentions, like something's going to go wrong, especially if you're moving fast, and just try to be ready for that and be able to react fast. The other one that I didn't kind of outline and put here is that that we have some recent experience with building a LLM capability on short notice, because let's just say hypothetically we had a bunch of visitors from a foreign government come gather a bunch of emails and take that away from our environment, right? And so we had to build a very secure, very protected environment, rapidly, to have the capability to reason over all that information that our visitors, have taken away. And this goes back to that data protection and being understanding how, where that source of your model is and what access do you want to have to that information. So, like, hypothetically, you could just say that yes, the attacker would have all that information, and you could argue that that would be publicly available now because the attacker had taken it away. But for us as a company, we don't think about that as, and we've had this many discussions with our legal teams about it, which is like, do we think that's should we treat that data as public, or do we continue to think about, no, this is highly sensitive data that we need to protect to the greatest ability that we can, right? And that's definitely the direction that we took for it. And so, isolated environment, just sharing this in case you ever run into this situation, right? a very strong isolated environment with very restrictive controls, even to the point where the developers working in that environment, we had them interact in such a way where they couldn't access the data themselves. Like only the model could interact with the data. And then in the queries to the model had to be cleared through an approval process, and and then the results that we got from the model again had to go through a cleared process. Like the results would be stored in that isolated environment, in the isolated container. Only 2 people had access to see the results, and then they would take the results and basically sanitize those if needed, and then share them out. So, super controlled. Again, depends on the information that you're processing and how you want to handle it. But I just thought that might be useful to share an extreme case of how we did that. So I know we got to get to Q&A here, but just real quick on the takeaway and actions before we get to Q&A. Like data protection that didn't come through, like classify, label, protect, super critical, like really foundational, and I would really strongly advocate that you think about, if you don't have strong adoption or large adoption in your company, like really focus on that. That transparency across, if you're developing internally AI systems, like think about that transparency, and also think about what's your responsible AI requirements and standards. And again, back to the example that I just went through, like zero trust is critical, especially if you're dealing with very highly sensitive and very secure data. Like adopt the zero trust approach and procedures for that. Then, again, just think about how you want to adopt your standards and leverage those existing processes. So with that, I will just pause for questions if you got. And please, if you have questions, use the mics would be helpful.
A very interesting and informative talk. I have 2 questions. The first one is brief. You refer to various AI security standards,
yeah.
And I know the responsible AI standard is public. Are there other standards that are available to people so that they can use that as standard or best practices?
I think your question, are there other standards out there that are
from
publicly
Microsoft?
available?
You refer to a couple of them that you enforce in Microsoft.
Yeah.
Other than the responsible AI standard, are there other standards that are public?
From Microsoft itself?
Yeah.
So I can take that. Hi, this is Vivek here. I work with Brian on Brian's team. So we have taken like the CIS benchmark and the NIST AI RMF, and we tried to map it to our enterprise security standards. Work is ongoing to incorporate things like the EU AI and the ISO 42000 that has Gen AI aspects attached to it. So it's a continuous process that is going on.
Okay, thank you. And the second question I have is, as I understand, like if you have a corporate OpenAI on Microsoft Azure license, and when you are basically exposing data, it will remain and training the model. The incremental model will only be available to the company subscription. So if suppose confidential or secret data is inadvertently exposed and there is an incident, what are the steps that you recommend, like we can do to still protect the data or make sure it is not accessible to other people inside or outside the company?
I think you're asking what we would do to protect the data that's being used with the model?
No, it's basically like incident response.
Oh,
so once somebody inadvertently exposes secret data or confidential data to the model, that is part of like OpenAI on Azure. What can the company do as an incident response step?
So if your data is taken away, how do you respond to that situation? Yeah, that's a tough one. Like, I guess in the case where we had data taken away, there's really not much we can do other than reason over what was taken and determine if there's any risk that the company's exposed to because of the data. So for our situation, right, were there secrets in that data? Was there any sort of information about exceptions that existed? Were there vulnerabilities that might have been disclosed? So it kind of depends on what your data is that you're using with your model. But that would be that's been an approach that we've taken is, okay, we can't do anything about the data that was taken away. That's out of our control. But what can we understand? What can we do to understand what risk we're now exposed to now that the data is out the door?
Already out there. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great question.
First, I've got to say that visitors from a foreign government's the best euphemism I've heard all day. But when you're doing your program, your SDL requirement 3 is on user permissions. Did you find that your program had to drive like requirements on the dependencies for the LLMs? For example, in my previous company, we found that OAuth would be the best way for the LLM agent to talk to an application, but some of the applications didn't support OAuth 2, right? And so there wasn't a good way to give the LLM limited access to the application. It was either God mode or nothing, basically.
We do get more specific into how the LMs have to interact in terms of like authentication, authorization, and encryption and logging. Like we have specific libraries that we believe that they need to go execute on and use. And so, we do have that. We used to have that as a recommended best practice. Now we have it as a must do, and we check and validate that going forward.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I have a query regarding the data classification. When the customers are using the Azure OpenAI services, it is the responsibility of the customers to classify the data and then feed into the OpenAI services, or is it like being done by the Azure AI as well?
It's the responsibility of the customer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, gentlemen. So my question is this: you mentioned, some standards for security and responsible, I suppose, AI.
Yep.
How are you guys conveying that to the ISVs that you work with, who are leveraging your tools, as well as your, generative AI products? Is there any sort of assurance that you pass on to the end customer in terms of responsible use?
I believe we make that available to customers and we're transparent about it, but I don't, off the top of my head, know exactly where we publish that and how we publish it. Do you?
Yeah, for today, I think we don't publish externally, but there are discussions ongoing with various product groups as to some level of attestation or assurance so that customers know, okay, these applications have gone through the stringent process. Anything which is external customer facing has to go through. There's no skipping the RAI and the DSP process that Brian spoke about. So that happens, but we've given the same feedback to our product teams as well, that there's no visible queue of, okay, these many checks were performed, so there's some level of assurance. Yeah, thanks.
So I know Microsoft has their own copilots that you're providing to the customers, but let's say that I want to build my own copilots, meaning I want to build my own application. A copilot is just an application, right, with my own data in which I want to build on top of the Microsoft platform. What services are you providing? I mean, I understand this, but should I just use the Microsoft Copilot? But if I want to build my own, what should I do?
I can take that.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if you're aware of the recent announcements on Azure AI. We announced a bunch of like prompt shields and mitigation controls for groundedness detection. So those are controls that we have been asking customers, asking our product groups to make it externally available, and that's a result of a lot of back and forth conversations, so that you're not restricted to just our own Copilot. So let's say you want to use Azure OpenAI and build your own Copilot instance based on your data set and the work that you have done. Those controls, those mitigation, those checks will automatically, you can benefit from those as well. Yep.
I have a quick question. I know you mentioned monitoring and logs. Is there a way for a Copilot admin to actually view the logs of what the employees within the company are prompting Copilot for? So
is there a way for them to view? I don't believe the Copilot admin can do it. That would be in our investigations and response team, and it would have to be done with our SOC, and usually an incident would trigger that. Otherwise, the activity of the employee would be protected for privacy purposes.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. Thanks so much. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vivek.